When World War II began in September 1939, it was not yet the total, all-consuming catastrophe it would soon become. But from the very first weeks, one reality was already clear to every major power involved: another long war of trenches, mass infantry assaults, and generational slaughter was politically and socially unacceptable. The memory of the First World War was still raw. Entire cities still carried its scars. Millions of families still lived with its absence. As a result, leaders on both sides searched urgently for something different, a decisive blow, a way to end the war quickly without sending millions of young men to die in mud and wire. This search for a knockout solution shaped the entire early strategy of the war. For Adolf Hitler, the collapse of Poland had been swift and spectacular. Blitzkrieg had worked exactly as promised, but Britain was not Poland. Britain was an island, protected by water, distance, and the most powerful navy in the world. German tanks could not simply roll across the English Channel. There would be no lightning advance, no encirclement, no sudden political collapse. If Britain was to be defeated, it would have to be isolated, weakened, and slowly strangled. German planners quickly concluded that Britain's greatest vulnerability was not its army, but its dependence on overseas trade. Britain imported much of its food, fuel, and raw materials. Cut those sea lanes and the island would eventually starve. Thus, Germany turned to the weapon it believed could quietly win the war: the submarine. U-boats were relatively cheap, difficult to detect, and devastating against unprotected merchant shipping. By sinking enough cargo vessels, Germany hoped to sever Britain's lifeline, forcing surrender without the need for invasion. This approach was not glamorous. It did not offer the spectacle of battlefield triumph. But it seemed logical, efficient, and above all, economical in human lives, at least German lives. On the surface, it appeared to be a war-winning strategy. Yet Germany's enemies faced their own strategic dilemma. For Britain and, eventually, the United States, the problem was just as severe, but reversed. There were no allied armies on the European continent capable of challenging German forces directly. France would soon fall. The Low Countries would be occupied. Any attempt to land troops in force would be suicidal. The Western Allies possessed one weapon that could reach Germany immediately: the bomber. Long-range aircraft offered something unprecedented in military history. They could strike the enemy's heartland directly: factories, rail networks, power stations, without first defeating the enemy's army. If used correctly, bombers promised to bypass the battlefield entirely. This idea was not new. It had been theorized since the 1920s by air power advocates who claimed that future wars would be decided not by soldiers, but by industrial collapse and civilian morale. Destroy a nation's ability to produce weapons, and its armies would wither. Break the will of its population, and its leaders would be forced to negotiate. Strategic bombing, in theory, was humane, or at least more humane than trench warfare. It promised fewer soldiers killed, shorter wars, and decisive results. In 1939, these ideas were still largely untested. No modern industrial nation had yet been subjected to sustained, large-scale bombing. Many military planners believed that societies would crack quickly under aerial assault. The war's opening months reflected this cautious optimism. Both sides initially imposed strict limits on bombing targets. Attacks on civilians were officially discouraged. Precision was the stated goal. Bombers were supposed to strike military and industrial targets only: factories, rail junctions, ports. The language was careful. The intentions, at least on paper, were restrained. But even at this early stage, reality was already intruding. Navigation was unreliable. Weather obscured targets. Bombing accuracy was far worse than planners admitted. Crews often dropped bombs miles from their intended objectives, sometimes without ever seeing their targets at all. Still, the belief remained strong that technology would soon solve these problems. Better bomb sites, better aircraft, better training. The solution, it was thought, was refinement, not restraint. What united both German and Allied thinking during this period was a shared illusion that the war could be won cheaply. Germany believed submarines could silently strangle Britain. Britain believed bombers could cripple Germany without mass invasions. Both believed that industrial societies were fragile. Both believed morale would collapse under pressure, and both were wrong. What they were actually creating was not a shortcut to victory, but a new battlefield, one that would stretch across oceans and skies, cities and factories, and eventually involve civilians on an unprecedented scale. As 1940 approached, these competing knockout strategies were about to collide with reality, and with each other. Before we continue, if you're finding this analysis insightful, please click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps this channel reach more people who care about serious, well-researched history, and it allows us to keep producing long-form documentaries like this one. The first true era of strategic bombing did not begin with a carefully planned doctrine or a deliberate policy decision. It began by accident. In August 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged in the skies, a small number of German bombers lost their way during a night raid. Disoriented by weather and navigation errors, they released their bombs over London instead of their intended military targets. The damage itself was limited, but the political consequences were enormous. Until that moment, both Britain and Germany had officially restrained themselves from attacking each other's capital cities. Civilian morale was understood to be a sensitive issue, and both sides feared escalation. The accidental bombing of London shattered that restraint. Britain responded almost immediately by bombing Berlin. From a purely military perspective, the British raid caused little damage. German industry remained untouched, but psychologically, it struck a nerve. Berlin had been presented to the German public as untouchable, the secure heart of the Reich. British bombs proved otherwise. Hitler was furious. Within weeks, German air strategy shifted decisively. The Luftwaffe turned away from airfields and radar stations and toward Britain's cities. The goal was no longer air superiority alone. It was punishment, pressure, submission. Thus began the Blitz. Night after night, German bombers crossed the Channel and descended on London, Coventry, Liverpool, and dozens of other urban centers. Explosive bombs shattered buildings. Incendiaries ignited fires that spread block by block. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. German leaders believed they were witnessing the future of warfare. They were confident that no modern society could withstand sustained aerial bombardment. Civilians would panic, industry would halt. The government would be forced to negotiate. Once again, air power promised a knockout blow. But something unexpected happened. British morale did not collapse. Despite enormous destruction and tens of thousands of civilian casualties, daily life continued. Factories resumed production within days of being hit. Underground stations became shelters. Firefighters worked through the night. The government maintained control. The Blitz became a symbol of endurance rather than defeat. This resilience stunned German planners. The Luftwaffe had not been designed for prolonged strategic bombing. It lacked heavy bombers capable of carrying large payloads over long distances. Its crews were exhausted, losses mounted. And as the months passed, the campaign failed to achieve its central aim. Britain did not surrender. By the spring of 1941, the Blitz was losing momentum. German aircraft were increasingly needed elsewhere. Hitler's attention was turning eastward, toward the vast and looming confrontation with the Soviet Union. When Germany launched its invasion of Russia in June 1941, the Blitz effectively ended. Aircraft, fuel, and crews were redirected. Britain had survived the first sustained bombing campaign in history, but survival did not mean victory. For Britain, the end of the Blitz brought clarity and a hard truth. Bombing was still the only way to strike Germany directly. There would be no invasion of Europe for years, no second front. If Britain wanted to stay in the war and justify the sacrifices already made, it needed a way to hurt Germany. And bombing, despite its failures, remained the only option. During the Blitz, British bombers had conducted raids on German cities, But these efforts had been limited and largely ineffective. Aircraft were small, payloads were light, accuracy was poor, losses were high. Now, however, new machines were beginning to arrive. British aircraft manufacturers had been working feverishly to produce a new generation of heavy bombers. These aircraft were larger, faster, and capable of carrying far heavier bomb loads. They represented a dramatic leap in destructive potential. With these bombers came renewed optimism. British planners believed that what had failed before could succeed now, if only it were done at greater scale. If hundreds of bombers could strike in a single night, German defenses might be overwhelmed. Fires would spread, industry would suffer. Morale might finally crack. The lessons of the Blitz were interpreted in conflicting ways. Some argued that bombing civilians was immoral and ineffective. Others concluded that it had simply not been done forcefully enough. In this debate, one assumption went largely unchallenged: that bombing could still end the war. What changed was not the goal, but the willingness to compromise. Navigation errors continued. Bombs missed targets. Crews returned uncertain of what they had hit, yet pressure mounted to show results. Britain needed visible proof that it was striking back. Behind closed doors, analysts began quietly acknowledging an uncomfortable reality. Precision bombing at night over defended territory was far more difficult than anyone had admitted. Crews could not reliably identify factories. Clouds obscured landmarks, smoke and fires created confusion. Bombs fell where they fell. The moral distinction between military and civilian targets began to blur. What had started as accidental escalation during the Blitz had revealed something deeper. Modern air war was uncontrollable. Once cities became targets, restraint was fragile. Once civilians were involved, boundaries collapsed. By late 1941, Britain stood at a crossroads. It had survived Germany's attempt at aerial coercion. It had invested heavily in bombers as its primary offensive weapon, but it had not yet found a way to make bombing decisive. The next phase of the air war would be shaped not by confidence, but by frustration and by evidence that could no longer be ignored. By early 1941, Britain's faith in air power had not disappeared, but it had changed. The optimism of theory was giving way to the pressure of evidence. Strategic bombing was no longer an abstract promise. It was an ongoing campaign, and it was failing to deliver decisive results. Yet rather than abandon bombing, British leaders doubled down on it. New aircraft were entering service in growing numbers. Heavy bombers such as the Short Stirling represented a dramatic increase in capability. These machines were massive by contemporary standards, capable of carrying bomb loads of up to 18,000 pounds, 4 times more than earlier aircraft. On paper, they offered everything strategic bombing had promised: reach, payload, and persistence. With them came renewed emphasis on precision. British planners still believed that carefully selected targets, railways, power stations, oil facilities, and industrial hubs could cripple Germany's war effort if struck accurately and repeatedly. Crews were trained to identify specific objectives. Briefings emphasized restraint and discipline. The intention remained focused on infrastructure, not terror, but intention collided with reality. Night bombing, which was necessary to reduce losses from German fighters, made accurate navigation extremely difficult. Clouds obscured landmarks, cities were blacked out. Ground features looked unfamiliar from altitude, bomb sites were primitive. Crews often released their payloads based on dead reckoning rather than visual confirmation. The results were deeply unsettling. In August 1941, the British government received a secret analysis that stripped away illusion. The report revealed that only about 10% of RAF bombers were dropping their bombs within 5 miles of their intended targets when attacking Germany's main industrial regions. 5 miles in urban Europe meant the difference between a factory and a residential district, or missing the city entirely. At the same time, losses were mounting. German air defenses were becoming increasingly effective. Fighters intercepted bombers on the return journey. Anti-aircraft guns filled the skies over major cities. In some raids, nearly 1 in 10 bombers failed to return. Crews were killed, captured, or vanished without trace. These loss rates were unsustainable. At this point, British leaders faced a stark choice. They could scale back the bombing campaign and accept its limitations, or they could change its purpose. They chose the latter. Precision, already largely illusory, was quietly deprioritized. In its place emerged a new concept: area bombing. Rather than attempting to strike individual factories, entire city districts would be targeted. Bomb loads were designed to start fires. Incendiaries were used alongside high explosives to overwhelm firefighting services. The objective expanded from physical destruction to psychological impact. This was not presented publicly as a moral shift, it was framed as necessity. If bombs could not be placed accurately, then concentration and scale would compensate. Area bombing did not promise clean results, it promised visible ones. The strategy found its most forceful advocate in Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, who assumed command of RAF Bomber Command in early 1942. Harris was blunt, relentless, and unapologetic. He believed that bombing cities would break German morale and shorten the war. He dismissed concerns about civilian casualties as sentimental distractions from victory. Under Harris, Bomber Command changed tone as well as tactics. The campaign's defining moment came the spring of 1942. Harris planned an operation designed not only to damage Germany, but to prove a point to his own government. More than 1,000 bombers were assembled for a single raid, an unprecedented concentration of air power. Their target was the city of Cologne. On the night of the attack, German defenses were overwhelmed by sheer volume. Searchlights and fighters struggled to respond to so many aircraft at once. Bombs rained down across the city, fires spread rapidly. By morning, over 600 acres of Cologne lay devastated. British losses were remarkably low. For Harris, the raid was vindication. He had demonstrated that mass bombing could penetrate German defenses and deliver destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. For political leaders, it offered proof that bombing could produce measurable results. Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave his full backing. From this point forward, area bombing became the core of Britain's air strategy. The line between industrial targets and civilian neighborhoods all but vanished. Entire cities were redefined as legitimate objectives, yet even in success, doubts lingered. German war production did not collapse, morale did not break. Reconstruction began almost immediately, factories dispersed, defenses adapted. Each raid required greater effort to achieve similar results. What had changed was not the effectiveness of bombing, but the scale of destruction required to justify its continuation. Strategic bombing had crossed a threshold. It was no longer about precise strikes or quick victory. It was about pressure, endurance, and escalation. It was about proving that sacrifice was not being made in vain. Before we move into the final phase of this transformation, take a moment, click the subscribe button, and like the video. It genuinely helps this documentary reach a wider audience and ensures more deeply researched history like this can be made. By the summer of 1942, the air war over Europe was entering a new and decisive phase. Britain was no longer fighting alone, and strategic bombing was no longer a purely British experiment driven by desperation and adaptation. The United States had arrived, bringing with it not only new aircraft, but a fundamentally different philosophy of how air power should be used. American planners had watched Britain's bombing campaign closely. They acknowledged British losses and technical difficulties, but they drew very different conclusions. Where the British saw the failure of precision bombing at night, Americans saw the failure of bombing at night itself. The United States Army Air Forces believed that daylight bombing, conducted with tight formations of heavily armed aircraft, could succeed where Britain had struggled. Their confidence rested on two pillars: technology and doctrine. The centerpiece of this belief was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. It was large, rugged, and bristling with defensive machine guns. Combined with the Norden bombsight, which promised unprecedented accuracy, American commanders argued that bombers could fight their way through enemy defenses, strike precise industrial targets, and return without fighter escort. It was a bold claim, and it stood in stark contrast to British experience. The Americans put their theory to the test in August 1942. Daylight raids were launched against marshalling yards in occupied France. The results were modest, damage was limited. But critically, no bombers were lost. To American leadership, this was proof that their doctrine worked. Precision bombing in daylight was not only possible, it was sustainable. To British commanders, the test proved something else entirely, that lightly defended targets near the coast were not representative of Germany's heavily protected industrial heartland. The disagreement was not merely technical, it was philosophical. The British had been forced into area bombing by years of attrition, navigational failure, and political pressure. The Americans still believed that restraint, accuracy, and selectivity could win the war faster and more cleanly. Neither side fully convinced the other. By the end of 1942, the Allies settled on a compromise that would define the air war going forward. The Americans would bomb by day, targeting factories, rail hubs, and infrastructure. The British would bomb by night, saturating urban areas and overwhelming defenses. This arrangement became known as the Combined Bomber Offensive. It was massive in scale and unprecedented in ambition. Factories across Britain ran continuously to produce aircraft. Airfields multiplied. Crews were trained, lost, and replaced at astonishing rates. The skies over Western Europe became a permanent battlefield. One of the clearest demonstrations of this new phase came in March 1943 during an attack on Essen, a critical center of German heavy industry. British Mosquito aircraft flew ahead of the main force, marking targets with flares. Nearly 450 Lancaster bombers followed, dropping their payloads across the city. German defenses were initially overwhelmed. Losses were relatively low, fires burned across industrial districts. It appeared, once again, that the long-awaited breakthrough might be near, but Germany adapted. Air defenses were reorganized, fighter control improved. Anti-aircraft fire became more accurate. New tactics were developed to intercept bomber streams. The skies grew more dangerous with every passing month. By mid-1943, Allied losses were rising sharply. On some missions, 1 bomber in 10 failed to return, a rate eerily similar to the crisis Britain had faced 2 years earlier. Crews understood that survival was increasingly a matter of chance. Meanwhile, the results remained ambiguous. German industry suffered damage, but production did not collapse. Output fluctuated, adapted, and in some cases even increased. Civilians endured devastation, but morale did not shatter in the way early theorists had predicted. Strategic bombing had not delivered a knockout blow. What it had become instead was a war of attrition in the air, grinding, costly, and relentless. Cities burned, crews died, resources were consumed at a staggering pace. Victory, when it came, would not be cheap or quick. By 1943, the original dream that had animated air power advocates before the war was gone. Bombing would not end the conflict on its own. It would not spare entire generations from combat. It would not replace armies, but it would shape the war profoundly. Strategic bombing tied down enormous German resources. It forced dispersion, adaptation, and constant repair. It inflicted suffering on a scale never before seen from the air. And it prepared the ground, economically, militarily, and psychologically, for the invasions that would eventually come. The knockout blow never arrived. Instead, victory would emerge from endurance, coordination, and sacrifice, fought not only on beaches and battlefields, but night after night in the dark skies over Europe.